The candles on the dining table flickered like they were laughing at me. 25 years of marriage, and here I was, sitting at the head of the table with a half-empty wine glass in my hand, watching Patricia's lips curl into that familiar smirk as she tore me apart in front of our friends. "Charles," she began, her voice dripping with that faux sweetness she reserved for public humiliation. "You've always been so consistent. I mean, how many teachers can say they've spent 20 years in the same classroom, teaching the same lessons?" She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a bad smell. "It's almost impressive, really, like watching a hamster on a wheel." The room went quiet, save for the faint clinking of silverware against plates. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me. Our neighbors, the couple from the gym, even my old college buddy, Mike, who was studiously avoiding my gaze by focusing on his steak. The candlelight cast long shadows across the table, making Patricia's face look sharper, more predatory. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her wine glass, the sound echoing in the silence. "And your little blog," she continued, her tone shifting to mock concern. "All those conspiracy theories about, what was it, the government tracking us through our toasters? Honestly, Charles, it's adorable. Like watching a toddler try to solve a Rubik's Cube." I forced a smile, the kind that feels like it's carved into your face with a rusty spoon. My fingers tightened around my wine glass, the stem cold and brittle against my palm. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat like barbed wire. Instead, I glanced at the empty chair next to me, where our son, Tom, should have been sitting. He'd begged off coming, claiming he had to work late. Smart kid. Patricia wasn't done. "But hey, at least you're predictable, right? I always know exactly where you'll be, sitting in front of that old laptop of yours, typing away like the world's most boring superhero. Captain Mediocrity, saving the world one poorly researched blog post at a time." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, but it died quickly, swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. I caught Mike's eye for a split second, and the pity in his expression made my stomach churn. The flickering candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller, tighter, like it was closing in on me. I reached for the wine bottle, but it was empty. Of course it was. Patricia had made sure of that. She always did. I was halfway to the front door, my coat slung over my arm, when I felt his hand clamp down on me. My son's grip was strong, almost desperate, like he was holding me back from stepping off a ledge. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between us. I turned to look at him, and his face was pale, his jaw tight. His other hand was clenched into a fist, knuckles white, as if he were bracing himself for what he was about to say. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling, "you need to know the truth." I froze. The air in the room felt heavier, like the weight of his words was pressing down on me. I could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or anger. It was hard to tell. Behind us, the dining room was eerily quiet, the guests still seated around the table. Patricia's untouched dessert plate sat in front of her empty chair, the chocolate mousse untouched, the spoon resting neatly beside it. I remember thinking how strange it was, how she always loved dessert. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice low, though I already knew. Deep down, I think I'd known for a while. He glanced over his shoulder, then pulled me further into the hallway, out of earshot. His breath was uneven, like he'd been running. "It's Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "She's been seeing someone, one of her clients, a psychotherapist." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't react. Not at first. I just stood there, staring at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Patricia, my Patricia, the woman I'd built a life with, raised a family with? It didn't seem possible. But then, the pieces started to fall into place. The late nights at work, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she'd been so dismissive of me lately. It all made sense now. "How long?" I asked, my voice steady, though I felt anything but. "A few months," he said, his eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Not after what she said tonight." I nodded, my mind racing. A few months. That meant it had been going on while we were planning our anniversary dinner. while we were pretending everything was fine. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I pushed it down. Now wasn't the time. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally, my voice hoarse. "I don't know what I'm going to do, but thank you." He nodded, his grip on my arm loosening slightly. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm really sorry." I didn't say anything else. I just turned and walked out the door, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. As I got into my car, I could still hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, a constant, unrelenting noise that seemed to echo in my head. And all I could think about was that untouched dessert plate, sitting there like a cruel reminder of everything I'd lost. The last guest had barely closed the front door when I turned to face her. The house felt hollow, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Patricia was already pouring herself another glass of wine, her back to me, the click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoing like gunshots. I glanced at the cracked wedding photo frame on the mantel, our faces frozen in a moment that now felt like a cruel joke. "So," I said, my voice steady but low, like the hum of a storm gathering in the distance. "You're not even going to deny it?" She turned slowly, her face pale but her eyes sharp, like a predator sizing up its next move. "Deny what?" she asked, her tone dripping with mock innocence. "That I found someone who actually listens to me? Someone who doesn't bury himself in conspiracy theories and self-pity." Her words hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch. The dog outside barked again, a distant, frantic sound that seemed to underline the chaos in the room. I took a step closer, my hands clenched at my sides. "You've been sleeping with him, haven't you? Your client." She didn't blink. Instead, she smirked, swirling the wine in her glass like she was savoring the moment. "Oh, Charles," she said, her voice a mix of pity and disdain. "You've always been too naive to see what's right in front of you. Did you really think I'd stay loyal to someone who couldn't even bother to ask how my day was?" I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice even. "You're blaming me for this? For your betrayal?" She set the glass down with a sharp clink, her designer heels clicking as she stepped closer. "You want to play the victim? Fine. But let's not pretend this is all on me. You've been checked out for years. Always with your books, your blog, your little theories about the world falling apart. Meanwhile, I've been carrying this marriage, this life on my back. Did you ever stop to think about what I needed? Or were you too busy chasing ghosts?" Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they were calculated to hurt. I glanced at the cracked photo frame again, the glass spiderwebbed over our smiling faces. "So that's your excuse? I wasn't paying enough attention. So you decided to jump into bed with someone else?" She laughed, a cold, brittle sound that made my skin crawl. "Excuse? No, Charles. This isn't about excuses. This is about survival. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to feel so alone in my own home that I had to find comfort somewhere else? You did this. You pushed me to it." The dog outside barked again, louder this time, and I felt the weight of her words settle over me like a shroud. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even ashamed. She was defiant, her chin tilted up, her eyes blazing with a kind of triumph that made my stomach churn. I took a step back, my mind racing. This wasn't just about her affair. This was about power, control. She'd been rewriting the story of our marriage in her head for years, and now she was forcing me to live in her version of it. But as I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, I realized something. I didn't have to play her game. Not anymore. "You're right," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "I didn't see what was right in front of me, but now I do. And believe me, Patricia, you're going to regret showing me the truth." Her smirk faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "We'll see about that," she said, her heels clicking as she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the wreckage of what used to be our life. The study door clicked shut behind me, sealing me in a tomb of my own making. The flickering desk lamp cast jagged shadows across the room, making the conspiracy theory books on my shelf look like they were leaning forward, mocking me. I didn't turn on the overhead light. The dimness felt appropriate, like the world itself had dimmed the moment my son's words hit me. I slumped into my chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The faint smell of cold coffee lingered in the air, a relic from the morning when I'd still been living in blissful ignorance. The mug sat abandoned on the desk, a brown ring staining the wood beneath it. I stared at it, tracing the edges with my eyes, as if it held some kind of answer. But it was just a mug. Just like this room was just a room, and Patricia was just Patricia. Except she wasn't. Not anymore. My gaze drifted to the bookshelf, where titles like The Truth They Don't Want You to Know and Hidden Agendas sat gathering dust. I used to read them for fun, a way to escape the monotony of grading papers and faculty meetings. Now they felt like a cruel joke. All those hours spent dissecting shadowy cabals and government cover-ups, and I'd missed the conspiracy unfolding right under my nose. The desk lamp flickered again, and I slammed my palm against the base of it. The bulb steadied, but my hands didn't. I flexed my fingers, trying to ground myself, but the room felt like it was spinning. Patricia's voice echoed in my head. "You've always been too naive to see what's right in front of you." Was she right? Had I been blind? Or had I just chosen not to see? I reached for one of the books, pulling it off the shelf at random. The pages smelled musty, like they'd been trapped in time. I flipped through it aimlessly, my eyes catching on underlined passages and scribbled notes in the margins. "The truth is always hidden in plain sight," one line read. I snorted, tossing the book onto the desk. It landed with a thud, sending a puff of dust into the air. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen drifted through the walls, a steady, grounding sound. I focused on it, trying to push back the storm in my head. But the harder I tried, the louder it got. Images flashed in my mind. Patricia's designer heels clicking on the floor, her untouched dessert plate at dinner, the way she'd smirked when our son revealed the truth. It wasn't just the affair. It was the way she'd looked at me, like I was nothing, like I'd always been nothing. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. The sudden movement sent a stack of papers fluttering to the ground. I didn't bother picking them up. Instead, I paced the room, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I stopped in front of the window, staring out at the empty street. The streetlight flickered, casting long shadows on the pavement. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp and sudden. I flinched, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought about opening the window, letting the cold night air in. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at my reflection in the glass. The man looking back at me was a stranger, hollow-eyed, hunched, defeated. I turned away, my eyes landing on the cracked wedding photo frame on the desk. The glass was spiderwebbed, but Patricia's smile was still visible, bright and mocking. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. For a second, I thought about smashing it against the wall. But I didn't. I just set it back down, face first. The room was silent now, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I glanced at it, the hands creeping toward midnight. Time felt meaningless, like it had stopped the moment my life had unraveled. I sank back into the chair, my head in my hands. The conspiracy theory books stared down at me, their titles suddenly taking on a new meaning. Maybe I had been living in one all along. Not the kind with shadowy governments or secret societies, but a quieter, more personal one. A conspiracy of lies, built by the woman I'd trusted more than anyone. And the worst part? I had no one to blame but myself. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Patricia's heels clicking down the hallway, followed by the slam of the front door. She hadn't even bothered to say goodbye. My head was still heavy from the argument the night before, her words echoing like a bad song stuck in my head. Naive, distant, weak. The house felt hollow, like a shell of what it used to be, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else, something worse, I hadn't yet uncovered. I wandered into her office, a space I rarely entered. It was always her sanctuary, her domain. The faint scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral, still lingered in the air, clinging to the curtains and the leather chair she loved so much. The room was immaculate, as always, but something felt off. The drawer of her filing cabinet was slightly ajar, just enough to catch my eye. I hesitated. I'd never been one to snoop. But then again, I'd never been one to think my wife of 25 years would betray me in every conceivable way. I pulled the drawer open, and there it was. a stack of crumpled bank statements, held together by a rubber band that had lost its elasticity. My hands shook as I flipped through them, the numbers blurring together at first. Credit card statements with balances that made my stomach churn. Loan agreements I'd never seen before. Late payment notices stamped in bold red ink. The broken calculator on her desk suddenly made sense. I could picture her hunched over it late at night, trying to make the numbers work, trying to keep the facade intact. How many times had she reassured me that our finances were fine? How many times had I believed her, too wrapped up in my own world to question it? I sat down in her chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and spread the papers out in front of me. The numbers didn't lie. Tens of thousands of dollars in debt, hidden from me for years. My mind raced, trying to piece together how this had happened. The designer clothes, the lavish dinners with her clients, the sudden business trips that always seemed to coincide with her lover's schedule. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about control, about manipulation. She'd been playing a game, and I hadn't even realized I was a pawn. The anger hit me in waves, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I started methodically organizing the papers, making notes in the margins, cross-referencing dates and amounts. I wasn't the naive, distant man she thought I was. Not anymore. This was my house, my life, and I wasn't going to let her destroy it without a fight. By the time I heard her key turn in the lock, I had a plan. The papers were back in the drawer, the room exactly as she'd left it. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed more evidence, more leverage. But as I walked past her in the hallway, the faint scent of her perfume clinging to her like a second skin, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. The truth was ugly, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. The rain tapped against the window like a nervous heartbeat, steady but uneven. I sat at my desk, the lawyer's business card staring back at me from the polished wood surface. It was a simple white rectangle with black lettering, nothing fancy, but it felt heavier than it should. I picked it up, turned it over, and set it back down. My hand hovered over the phone, trembling slightly, before I finally grabbed it and dialed the number. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. Law offices of Mitchell and Green. How can I assist you? I cleared my throat, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. This is Charles Whitaker. I need to speak with someone about a divorce. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like I was speaking someone else's truth. But it was mine now. The receptionist transferred me to a paralegal, who scheduled me for a consultation the next day. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The rain outside had picked up, a steady drumroll now, and I couldn't tell if it was soothing or suffocating. My pen sat on the desk, and I picked it up, tapping it against the wood in a rhythm that matched the downpour. Tap, tap, tap. I opened the drawer where I'd been collecting the evidence, bank statements, credit card bills, emails I'd printed out. The stack was thicker than I'd expected, and seeing it all laid out felt like looking at a stranger's life. Who was this woman I'd married? The one who'd hidden debts, lied about where she was, and made me feel like I was losing my mind? I flipped through the papers, my jaw tightening as I remembered the way she'd laughed when I confronted her, like I was some clueless fool she'd been tolerating for years. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. It clung to everything, like a ghost that refused to leave. I got up and opened the window, letting the cold, wet air rush in. The rain smelled clean, sharp, and for a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in. I started organizing the documents into folders, labeling them with a precision that felt almost clinical. Financial records, communication logs, evidence of the affair. I didn't want to think about the last one, but I had to. The emails were the hardest to read, not because of the explicit details, but because of the casual cruelty in them. She'd called me predictable to him, said I was easy to manage. My hands shook as I slid them into the folder, but I didn't stop. The next morning, I drove to the lawyer's office in silence. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky was still gray, heavy with clouds that refused to break. I parked in the lot, sat for a moment, and then grabbed the folders from the passenger seat. The building was modern, all glass and steel, and the waiting room smelled like coffee and disinfectant. The lawyer, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted me with a firm handshake. Mr. Whitaker, she said, gesturing to a chair. Let's get started. I laid out the folders on the table, one by one, and watched her face as she flipped through them. She didn't say much, just nodded occasionally and made a few notes. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. This is comprehensive, she said. It's going to help us a lot. I nodded, my throat tight. Good. I want this over with. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. Divorce is never easy, she said. But with this kind of documentation, we'll be in a strong position. It's going to take time, though. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Patricia's sneer, the way she'd laughed at me, and felt a surge of anger that burned through the numbness. I'm ready, I said. It's time to end this. The pen on her desk tapped against the wood as she wrote something down, the sound sharp and deliberate. Outside, the rain began to fall again, harder this time, like the sky was finally letting go of everything it had been holding back. I sat there, listening to it, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe. I sat across from Patricia at the dining table, the same one where we'd shared countless meals, birthdays, and holidays. The evidence I'd gathered, bank statements, credit card bills, text messages, was spread out like a map of destruction. The half-empty bottle of wine between us glinted in the afternoon light, its contents a dark red that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. She poured herself another glass, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the stem like a metronome keeping time to some invisible beat. You think this will ruin me? She said, her voice smooth as silk. Her lips curled into a smirk, the kind that used to make me feel like I was in on some private joke. Now it just made my stomach turn. She took a slow sip of wine, her eyes never leaving mine. You're so predictable, Charles. I've already planned my next move. The distant hum of a lawnmower outside buzzed faintly, a sound so ordinary it felt almost absurd in the moment. I kept my hands flat on the table, resisting the urge to clench them into fists. What move is that? I asked, my voice steady. More lies? More secrets? Or are you just going to keep pretending this is somehow my fault? Her laugh was sharp, a sound that cut through the air like a blade. Oh, please. You've been so busy playing the martyr, you didn't even notice what was happening right under your nose. Do you really think our friends don't know? Do you think they haven't seen how weak you've been? How pathetic. I felt a flicker of anger, but I pushed it down, focusing on the weight of the papers in front of me. They'll see the truth, I said quietly. They'll see what you've done. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. The truth? You think anyone cares about the truth? People believe what they want to believe, Charles. And I've made sure they believe me. She tapped her nails against the table again, a rhythmic click, click, click that set my teeth on edge. You think you're going to walk away from this looking like the good guy? Think again. I glanced at the stack of papers, the evidence of her betrayal. The bank statements, the hidden debts, the messages with her so-called therapist. It was all there, laid out in black and white. But as I looked at her, I realized something that made my chest tighten. She wasn't afraid. Not even a little. She was calm, almost bored, like this was just another game she'd already won. You've been manipulating them, I said, more to myself than to her. Our friends, our neighbors, everyone. She shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. It's not manipulation if it's the truth. You have been weak. You have been distant. I just helped them see it. She took another sip of wine, her smirk widening. And now they'll see you for what you really are. A man who couldn't keep his own wife happy. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I thought about the barbecues, the holiday parties, the casual conversations over coffee. Had they all been part of her plan? Had every smile, every laugh, every shared moment been a lie? The room felt too small suddenly, the air thick with the scent of her perfume and the faint bitterness of spilled wine. I stood up, gathering the papers into a neat stack. It doesn't matter what they believe, I said, my voice low but firm. The truth is the truth, and sooner or later it'll come out. She leaned back in her chair, her smile never wavering. Good luck with that, Charles. But remember, when it all falls apart, you've got no one to blame but yourself. I walked out of the room, the sound of her nails tapping against the table echoing in my ears. The lawnmower was still humming outside, a steady, relentless noise that matched the pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Because somewhere deep down, I knew she was right about one thing. This wasn't over. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow over the community center's folding chairs. I stood at the front, my hand resting on the cold metal of the microphone stand. The room was packed. Friends, neighbors, even the couple from the golf club who always seemed to be laughing at something I wasn't in on. Patricia's empty seat in the front row stared back at me like a gaping wound. She hadn't shown up. Of course, she hadn't. She'd probably already spun some story about me being unstable or obsessed. But tonight, the truth was mine to tell. I cleared my throat, the sound crackling through the speakers. The room fell silent, save for the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat. I could see their faces, some curious, some uneasy, a few already half convinced of whatever Patricia had whispered in their ears over the years. My stomach churned, but I kept my voice steady. I didn't want to do this. I began, my words measured. But after everything that's happened, I owe it to myself, and to all of you, to set the record straight. I started with the affair. Not the sordid details, but the cold, hard facts. How she'd been meeting him, her so-called therapist, for years. How she'd spun it as professional development. A lie so polished it almost gleamed. I pulled out the receipts, texts, emails, even a photo of them leaving a hotel. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. I saw Judy from book club cover her mouth, her eyes wide. Then came the money. I laid it out like a math problem because that's what it was. The secret credit cards, the loans she'd taken out in my name, the unpaid bills I'd found stuffed in her desk drawer. I passed around copies of the statements, the numbers glaring like accusations. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus," and I felt a flicker of vindication. But the worst part, the part that made my chest ache, was the manipulation. How she'd been poisoning people against me for years. The little comments at dinner parties. "Oh, Charles is just so tired lately." Or, "He's been so withdrawn, I worry about him." The way she turned my love for conspiracy theories into a punchline, painting me as some paranoid lunatic. I could see the pieces clicking into place for some of them, the looks exchanged, the slow nods. When I finished, the room was dead silent. No applause, no cheers. Just the weight of the truth hanging in the air like smoke. I looked out at them, my hands trembling slightly on the edge of the podium. "I'm not asking for anything," I said, my voice quieter now. "I just wanted you to know the truth, because I've been living a lie for too long." As I stepped away from the microphone, the first person to approach me was Tom, my old college buddy. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, his face grim. "I had no idea, man," he said. "None of us did." I nodded, too exhausted to feel much of anything. The crowd began to disperse, their murmured conversations filling the room like static. I glanced back at Patricia's empty seat one last time, the ache in my chest sharp but familiar. She hadn't been there to hear it, but she'd feel the fallout soon enough. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind of crisp, unassuming package that could have held anything. A birthday card, a utility bill, or, in this case, the final chapter of a 25-year-long lie. The divorce decree sat heavy in my hands, the ink still fresh enough to smell faintly chemical. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb tracing the embossed seal of the courthouse. It felt like holding a relic from a life I no longer recognized. I set it down on the desk beside my laptop, where a half-finished blog post blinked at me. For years, I'd poured my energy into dissecting government cover-ups and extraterrestrial sightings, chasing shadows in the dark. Now, those theories felt like child's play compared to the labyrinth of deceit I just navigated. I closed the draft and opened a new one, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat on the blank screen. The tea beside me had gone cold, but I sipped it anyway. The bitterness matched the taste in my mouth, a flavor I'd grown accustomed to over the past months. Patricia had taken everything she could, our savings, my dignity, even some of our friends, but she couldn't take this. The quiet of my study, the hum of my laptop, the faint glow of the desk lamp. These were mine now, small victories in a war I hadn't even realized I was fighting. I started typing, not about aliens or shadow governments, but about betrayal. About the kind of lies that don't come from faceless entities but from the people you share a bed with, a life with. The words came easier than I expected. Each sentence a brick in the wall I was building around myself. Protection, not isolation. The sound of my son's laughter drifted in from the living room, muffled but unmistakable. He'd been staying with me more often since the split, his presence a grounding force in the chaos. I paused, listening to the rhythm of his voice as he talked on the phone, probably to his girlfriend. There was a lightness in his tone that hadn't been there before, as if the weight of his mother's secrets had been lifted from his shoulders too. I turned back to the screen, my fingers hovering over the keys. The blog post was almost done, but I hesitated. For so long, I'd used my writing as a shield, a way to deflect from the messiness of my own life. Now it felt different, raw, honest. I hit publish before I could second-guess myself. The sun was setting outside my window, the sky streaked with oranges and pinks that bled into the darkening blue. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of the wood familiar and comforting. The divorce decree still sat on the desk, but it didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a scar, proof that I'd survived. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, the steam curling up in lazy spirals. The laptop screen dimmed, the blog post now live for the world to see. I didn't know if anyone would read it, and for the first time I didn't care. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, about the truth, no matter how ugly, and the peace that came with finally facing it. The conspiracy theories could wait. For now, I had a life to rebuild. The sunset outside my window bled orange and purple across the sky, the kind of view I used to ignore when Patricia and I lived together. Back then, I was too busy tiptoeing around her moods, too preoccupied with trying to keep the peace. Now, as I sat in the quiet of my study, the fading light felt like permission to breathe again. The closed book on my desk, some conspiracy theory I'd been reading, seemed almost laughable now. What was a government cover-up compared to the web of lies I'd unraveled in my own marriage? I could hear my son in the next room, his laughter carrying through the walls. He'd come over to help me sort through the last of the boxes from the old house. Funny how a kid who'd once been too shy to speak up had become the one to pull me out of the darkness. That night at the anniversary dinner, when he grabbed my arm and told me the truth about Patricia, it was like he'd handed me a lifeline I didn't even know I needed. I didn't hate Patricia anymore. That's the part that surprised me the most. Oh, there were moments when the anger flared up, when I thought about the unpaid bills, the sneering way she dismissed me, the way she twisted our friends against me. But hate, that takes too much energy, and I've learned to save mine for better things. Like rebuilding my life, like writing my blog, not as an escape, but as a way to connect with people who feel as lost as I once did. Like sitting here, watching the sun dip below the horizon and knowing I'm okay. The best revenge, I've realized, isn't some grand gesture or public takedown. It's the quiet satisfaction of moving on. It's the way my son looks at me now, like he's proud of me for standing up for myself. It's the fact that I can sit in this room, surrounded by the life I've built for myself, and feel no need to look over my shoulder. Patricia's still out there, somewhere, plotting her next move, I'm sure. But she doesn't get to live rent-free in my head anymore. I closed the conspiracy book and slid it onto the shelf. The theories I used to obsess over, aliens, shadow governments, secret societies, seemed almost quaint now. The real conspiracies, the ones that hurt the most, are the ones we don't see coming. The ones that happen in our own homes, under our own roofs. But here's the thing about truth. It's like a knife. Cuts deep, but it also sets you free. The sound of my son's laughter drifted in again, and I smiled. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The sunset faded to dusk, and I got up to join him. Life, I've learned, isn't about avoiding the pain. It's about finding the strength to walk through it, and coming out the other side with your head held high. And if I can do it, anyone can.